All right, in this video, we're going to talk about JavaScript promises. In our last video, we were talking about callbacks as a way to handle asynchronous code. And remember, JavaScript is asynchronous because it is single-threaded, and we have the event loop, and we have to keep the event loop free to re-render the web page as needed. We don't want to block, right? So we don't want any synchronous code, any long-running synchronous code blocking the event loop because that's going to block our renders. So what we do is this sort of asynchronous JavaScript, all right? With callbacks, the problem we encountered, we'll switch back to that file real quick, is this sort of structure, right? So we have an asynchronous function. We pass in some data to our asynchronous function, and then we get this callback function, right? We have an error and the success data. So if there's an error, we actually call this callback function and pass in an error, right? And so that would be if there's an error, we're just exiting in our particular callback, right? And then if there's not an error, then we go through and we assume that we have some valid data. All right. So in this case, we are calling another async function, right? So we have this sort of chaining async function, and again we have the error situation, right? So we handle the errors if there is one. If not, we keep going, and then we have another async situation. Async call. Now the problem here is here at the end it's even more complex because we have Bob and Alice, and we only want to determine the winner after both of these async chains have completed. All right, so that adds some extra complexity, and we have to track these two variables independent of our flow, and we have to check to see if one of these variables has been set yet, and if it has, then we know we can run the final step, which is determine async winner. Okay, so this gets pretty ugly in a hurry. It's kind of hard to follow, kind of hard to read. All right, so what's been added to the JavaScript spec since 2015 is a really clever way to handle asynchronous code. Okay, and it's called a JavaScript promise. And this is basically, it's an asynchronous code execution pattern that helps solve the problem of deeply nested callbacks, right? Callback hell. A promise can either resolve with a value or reject with an error once the promise has been fulfilled, right? So it's fulfilled for a certain amount of time. It's asynchronous, so it's pending, right? The promise has not fulfilled if we don't get a response yet. Once it's fulfilled, it will either be resolved with a value or it will be rejected with an error. Okay. Additional functionality can be queued up for execution after the promise resolves or fulfills by using the attached .then method. .then takes a function. Okay. This method accepts as an argument a function whose parameter is the returned data. Okay. The then function methods can be chained one after the other, and if there are multiple async steps in the execution chain. Okay, so here's an example. We have some asynchronous function call, async return promise. We don't really care right now what it does, but it's asynchronous and it returns some data in the form of a promise. What we can do, you'll see it a couple different ways in code. Sometimes, since this returns a promise, the promise has a .then method, and you can call the .then method. What do you pass in there? A function that is that has the data as the argument or as the parameter. Okay, so this is upon a successful call, right? I like to do it like this, so all the thens line up, and you can kind of see a flow. When it gets like this, it's kind of, you can't always immediately see the then. All right, so this is just a signal that it's an asynchronous call, and also you see all the thens, so you know that this is promise based. Okay, so here is the promise, the then function. It's a resolved promise function, and the resolution again returns the data. Okay, so we don't have access to this data with the variable here, let data. That won't work. What we have here is a promise. And we could separately do something like this, promise dot then. So just so you know, these would be equivalent, right? But you'll often see them chained together, like something like this. Okay, now notice here in our resolved function here in the then, we have some other async modification. Okay, so if inside of a then function you return another async promise, right, then you can call .then again, and this will have resolved by the time this new method is called. Okay, and so this is the result of this being executed. So you get this nice flow of .then, async code, .then, async code. All right, so you have async code, there's some original data, then we want to modify that data asynchronously somehow, then we get that modified data back, and then we do something with it, and we're just logging it there, right? So that's just an example of the basics of promises. But how do we handle errors, right? So errors are very important. We have the .catch method. Okay. So in a similar way, a promise can provide access to errors via a .catch that takes a function as a parameter method attached to the promise itself. Use a .catch when you want to recover from an error and then continue the chain of execution. Okay. So sometimes an error occurs and it's to be expected, like you might have a null value or something. And if you do have a null value or an undefined value, then you want to create something new or something like that, right? So you have some async function call. You might be providing some argument data, and maybe you're supposed to have a user or something like that in here, and you don't have one, so you get an error. So we can correct that, and we can go ahead and create an error or create a user, and then continue. So whatever you return here is going to continue down the chain in the then statement. Okay, so we have an async return promise. You pass in some data, and then there's some error that occurs. We identify what the error is. We can look at the error.message, all right, and then we say, okay, we can correct this error. We're gonna return the corrected value that the next then statement is expecting, right, and then data here in this then statement becomes corrected only if there was an error. If there was no error, then whatever async return promise returns is our return data. Okay, so if there's an error, this is the string corrected. This is a really nice way of working with asynchronous functions, and it's quite a bit cleaner. Now, from this example, we can't tell that it's much cleaner from the callback hell, because we're not doing the whole callback hell example. So that's what we're going to do next. Well, first, let's demonstrate how to create a promise, and then we'll go into the callback hell example. Okay. So on the global object, you have access to capital P promise. All right. So this is a constructor function. So or it might be implemented as a class, but you can call new promise. Okay, this takes in a function. That function has parameters resolve and reject. Right, so this is the fat arrow syntax. All right, so this all we're doing is building a function that returns a promise. So we pass in some data, right? This would be like our async function. Pass in some data. We get a promise. Let promise equal new promise. That promise takes in a function, right? And if our passed in data is undefined, we call reject, right? That's like an error. You're supposed to have some data in here, so we say reject. What do we pass as the error? We generate a new error, promise rejected, no value provided to return. Okay, so this would be the error case, and then in the other case, we just resolve the data. All right, now this code is synchronous, but this is just an example of promises. In the next example, we're going to actually make asynchronous functions using the set timeout example with asyncify and all that stuff that we had, and we're going to make promises based on that and return them async. Okay, so what do we do at the end of this async promise function? Here we created our promise, and then all you do is return that promise. Right, so if everything works, you can have a .then attached to this, and you'll get some data back. Right, if there's an error, your .catch will execute, and you should return this error object. You have access to that. Okay, so let's see this in action. Okay, so this, as I said, this is not actually asynchronous, so we're going to see this go very quickly. There's no time delay. We're going to return promise hot, and only if we want to correct the error, we catch. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to at some point remove this argument, and then we'll see something like return hot. Right, so if there is no argument here, if there's no data, we're rejecting an error. All right, so if I remove this, then we would return this capitalized. If not, it'll be lowercase. Either way, because we have this catch, we should have some data. So even if it's an error, we are correcting that and then continuing on. Right, so then we have data here. We're going to log that out, and then we're going to add dog to this. Okay, if there's some sort of error in this code, right, then we're going to return in all caps hot dog. So we're correcting the error and then moving on. And then the final step would be console.log. Now, a very important note here is everything we're doing here is synchronous, right? So this would not be a reasonable thing to do using promises in the real world. You only want to use promises when you have async functions. So the thens should return async functions. You don't want a lot of chaining of thens because there is quite a bit of overhead, performance overhead to promises. They're very nice. They're very handy. Makes the code much easier to read, much easier to reason about, but there is a performance hit. So you don't want to just be chaining thens and catches all the time for no reason. Only do it when you have to deal with asynchrony. All right, so let's look at this. What happens? We're going to return hot, and that should be fine. We'll log hot, then we'll append dog, all lowercase, and then we'll just print out hot dog. So let's take a look at this. Okay, no time delay, very fast. What happens if we remove one of these? So we should get the error handling case, and we're going to print out the error.message. All errors have this .message property, which is effectively whatever you pass into the error constructor. And we'll see what that looks like. Promise rejected, no value provided to return. So we return this. And then that's actually logging out. Here's where we return it. Here's where it's logged out. Right, so that's this line. And then we move over the catch and log out hot dog, capital hot, lowercase dog. Right? What happens if we don't have any data here? That should be an error again, and then we're going to correct that with all caps, hot dog, and continue down the chain. Okay, promise rejected, promise rejected. So remember, the purpose of catch is to try to correct and then continue with the chain. If you don't want to continue with the chain, you might not want to catch. So you either catch at the very end in the case that you don't want to continue with the chain, or you have catches in the middle of the chain if you want to try to catch and continue. Let's say you catch and you decide the error is not what you intended to catch. You can raise the error again. You can just throw it again, right? So I could do something down here. If error is something in particular, throw error, and then it would go down to the next catch. So at the very end of your promise chain, you should always generally have a catch. And then you can have them sprinkled in between the then statements if you want to try to correct a particular error that could occur. All right. Let's put our arguments back there. There we go. And then back to normal. Okay, so that's the idea of promises. Let's take a look at the async callback hell, and we're gonna see if we can make this look a lot nicer with promises here. Okay. Okay, so this is basically, we're just copying what we had from callback hell. So I'm going to call this 6.1 async promises, and then this is callback hell fix. All right, something like that. Okay, so this is almost an exact replica of this callback hell, except I've taken out some of the sync testing. The idea is we have this helper function for random int. We can get a random integer, that's fine. But these are our simulated async functions, right? Right now they're synchronous, so we get user ID. This is all synchronous. We play the game, so we can play the game if we have the user ID, and then determine winner. We can only do this if we have both players' scores. Okay, so that's the idea. We made this asynchronous helper last time. Asyncify takes some synchronous function. You pass it a name, and that's just for logging purposes. And then the time is how long you want to delay it. So what we do is we want to return a function that is behaves asynchronously. This is just the default time if we don't include that. So we have an async function with some arguments, and then we're basically going to run the async function inside of a set timeout, right? And then log some information at the start. Then once the timeout function actually executes, we log some stuff that just gives us some idea of what's going on. We get some return value by calling the sync function with our async function arguments, right? And then we do this in a try catch. If there's an error with the callback, you return the error as the first parameter or the first argument when you're calling the callback. If there is no error, then we call the callback with undefined as the first argument, and then our return value as the second argument. Okay, so that's another reason the callback kind of system is a little bit clunky, but it is faster than promises. However, it's just a little bit harder to read, well, a lot harder to read. Okay, so promises are nice, but there is overhead, as I said before. Okay, so that's our async function, and then we return that. That's asyncify. And here we're just creating our async functions like that with asyncify. So now what I want to do is I have asyncify. I want to make promisify. Okay, and this is a common type of function you will see. There's utilities to do this. This is just kind of a quick way to do it yourself. But this is something you'll see out in the wild. Promise helpers, promisify. You pass in an asynchronous function, okay? And what am I wanting to return? A promise function, right? So a function that, when called, returns a promise. Okay, so we're starting with an async function, and we want a function later that's a promise function. So, okay, what are we going to have? We need to define this promise, and that's what we're going to return from our promise function, and then we return the promise function. What goes into our promise? So we have this new promise constructor that has one argument in it, Okay, you see this style in JavaScript all the time. It seems like kind of a lot, but it's really it's one argument, but you pass in functions as first-class citizens in JavaScript, and even we're calling another function that has a function as a argument, right? So you see this style in JavaScript all the time. You get used to it, but this is the argument to new promise. It's just a function with the resolve and reject functions available as parameters. So then we call our async function. We expand all of our arguments to whatever our promise function needed. And then we have the callback. So this is the callback where you have the error and the data. So real simple, if there's an error, we reject the error, and otherwise we return and resolve the data. All right? So either way, we're returning, resolving the data. All right. And then here, we're just taking those async functions and converting them to promise functions using Permissify. All right. So these are really good practice problems to work on. You know, I've shown you how to do this, but even seeing it, try to think it through on your own. Asyncify and Permissify, really good problems to help you practice and make sure you really understand the concepts. All right, so that's our promise, Permissify function, our helpers. So let's start with a promise test. All right, let's get this tested. So we're going to run this code. I'm going to have this helper function log and throw, and so this is just going to log the error and then throw it as needed. Okay. As I mentioned before, if you do a catch and you pass in a function, here we're just going to do a console.error, so it goes to the standard error channel of output, and then log the error, and then we're going to rethrow it, just because we're not actually going to correct anything here, right? Normally you want to use .catches if you're trying to correct an error and then continue the change. We're just trying to log the error, and then we're going to throw it again. All right, so what does this look like? What's our first promise? We have user one is Alice, and so we have promise one is get user ID promise, and we pass in user one, and then what do? We get an ID back, hopefully, right? So we should get .then ID, and then we return another play game promise with that ID. All right, and then we can call .then on that. Right? Okay, so let's see how this works. Go 06. .1, there we go. Okay, starting, get user ID, pass in Alice, then the set timeout function actually runs, so we're running with Alice. This is the then portion. The time was, or the ID was 1,000, and then we start the play game. That's asynchronous, so this is when we're defining the set timeout, we play the game with 1,000. This is when the timeout function actually runs with 1,000, and then we get some score back. So this is the play game promise then. Okay, so we've outlined the then functions there. Now, notice here I don't have any catches in the chain. So I probably want some catches, but that's, again, the catches in between the then steps, you only want to use the catches if you're trying to correct and continue. If there's no way for me to correct at this point in the chain, then I don't want to keep going through each of the then calls because my error is here. So I just go, if I want to log it out, I could do something like .catch, and then log and throw. Right, so this will just log it and rethrow it, and do something like that, and we should get an error message. Okay, error, username not found. Alice Cat was not found in the database, right? And then I threw it again, okay? And when I threw it again, we continue to go through here. I'm sorry, if I would have returned something, we'd continue the chain, right? But since I threw it again, we skip over all of the thens, and I don't have a catch, right? Since I don't have a catch, this is an uncaught promise, right? It's an uncaught promise rejection. All right, so here is logging the error, and then this is the uncaught promise rejection. Okay, it's the same error, but we just logged it out here and then rethrew it. And so this is after we threw it. Now I can do a dot catch here. We can do error dot message. All right, and that would give us some output, and it wouldn't end in the error. So this is us printing the error and then rethrowing it in the first catch, log and throw. And then here in the second catch, we're just printing out error.message, not the entire error, so we don't get all the stack trace, all this stuff. We just get the message, right? And then notice it skipped all the thens because we had the catch rethrow. Okay, so again, saying it a lot, but it's important. Only catch if you're trying to, if it's at the very end of the chain, you want to catch. Or catch if there is a way for you to recover from an error in the previous async call. You get some sort of error in that previous async, you want to catch and fix it in case there's a particular error, and then continue with the thens. That's when you have a catch in between. Otherwise, just have the catch at the end. All right, but I'm going to remove these for now. So we've got user 1, Alice. Okay, so basically we need to do the same thing with Bob. Let's get Bob's here with promise 2, with user 2 is Bob. And so these are asynchronous, so you'll see these execute. It depends on the time it takes for these to resolve, but they'll be happening. There'll be the synchronous code in each of these chunks, like these functions, will be interleaved depending on when the data comes back. All right, so we run this. We get 2 different outputs. Okay, so now this is already a lot cleaner. So compare this to our async hell, right? This, but we have one more step here. This determine the winner. This is what really makes this an ugly process, right? Determine the winner async, because we have to manually keep track of which promises have completed. So there's actually something on the promise object called promise.all, and that allows you to do just this. You have an array of promises, and it can be as many as you want, but as soon as all of them execute, then you can call .then, and you'll get an array of results. And so then we know all of these promises have finished, so we're going to determine the winner, and promise 1 is Alice, and so result 0 is going to be Alice's results. Promise 2 is user 2, which is Bob, and so we're going to get we're going to determine the winner for Bob, and then the second item in the array results. Okay, so again, we don't have a catch because if there's an error here, we're not trying to recover. And then we have then here, and we're not doing anything. There's no results to determine the winner. This just console logs. And then we're just having a then here to say that we have a then here and say game over, right? Just because we said game over in async hell. So again, look how much cleaner this is. There's not a whole lot of nested functions. There's not a whole lot of nesting. At most, we nest one indentation level, which this is just much, much cleaner, right? And so at the very end, we have a catch. You always want to catch at the very end, and we're just going to log and rethrow if we do have an error. All right, you wouldn't want to rethrow probably at the end if you had an error, but all right, so let's run this and see. Okay, determine winner. So Bob won. All right, and then Bob won again. All right, Bob's killing it. All right, so that's the idea, and then we should get Alice to win. There she goes. Okay, so that is, again, compare this code to this. Much cleaner, much nicer. The callbacks, again, are faster, so be careful with your promises, but they're very, very nice. Makes your code very easy to reason about. All right, and then promises, like I said, I've been around since 2015, and there's a fetch API that has been built around it that allows you to make HTTP requests, and that's really nice, and it uses promises by default. A lot of node packages that used to use callbacks, there are now promise versions of those libraries. So the FS library, for example, the file system library, accessing files and doing anything like that, you can now, instead of using callbacks, you can use promises. There's a separate file you can import, and all of the same functionality, except it returns promises instead of having to use that callback methodology. You can also, if you know a function returns or makes use of callbacks, you can have a promisify function like we made, right? And there's also one built in, or there's packages for promisify. I think it's node util, something like that has a promisify function. But most of them are built in now, so you don't really need that much. All right, so promises are nice. And then there's one more video we're going to do that relates to promises, because while this is really nice, it's still not perfect. We like reading synchronous code. So the next video is going to be about async await. And async await are two keywords in JavaScript that basically allow us to make use of promises and make it look like asynchronous code, or make it look like synchronous code. All right, so any function that returns a promise, we can do an await. If we've defined an async function, we can await the async function, and it looks just like synchronous JavaScript. So as nice as this looks, async await looks even better. So all of this, it's a lot to talk about. However, like callbacks, asynchrony callbacks, promises, and async await are used absolutely everywhere in JavaScript, so it's a really important topic. It was a little bit hard to get through, but very, very, very important. All right, so that's it for this video. Thanks for watching.